Welcome to week 4 of political economy. Today we're going to be looking at spatial models of politics. What are spatial models? Well, we're all already familiar with some of the core ingredients, namely the idea that politics takes place along some sort of ideological spectrum from left to right. If I ask you about your country or the UK and what party is right, what party is left, I think most of you would be able to use these terms already. So we have to think a little bit about what they mean. And maybe some of you have taken something like a political compass, this kind of tests where you can answer some questions and then they place you in some sort of ideological continuum that usually ranges either from just left to right, and it's usually an economic scale, thinking about sort of communism on the left and sort of free market capitalism on the right. And sometimes there's a second dimension, a social dimension that basically ranges from liberal values to more authoritarian traditional values. And these terms, left and right, they of course go back to the French Revolution, where during the in the first National Assembly, basically the supporters of the king sat on the right and the radicals on the left of the president's view, and this kind of terminology basically stuck, and politicians and voters and newspapers and everyone around the world basically continued to describe politics in a left and right fashion. And this dimensionality, this idea that there's some sort of latent dimension that distinguishes different ideologies and that structures thoughts about, for example, free market versus government intervention. This idea forms the basis of spatial models of political competition. So, what are we going to look at today? Specifically, we're going to look at the median voter theorem, and specifically in the case of sort of committees and assemblies, parliaments, so relatively small groups, and we will revisit our sort of running example of the Brexit votes last year. And then we will also apply this median voter theorem to mass elections, to elections in general, and that's the Downesian spatial model, back to Anthony Downs' 1957 book, An Economic Theory of Democracy. And at the end, we'll also talk about measurement. So can we actually capture these latent dimensions of political competition through surveys and other means? Remember that last week we looked at the end phase of Theresa May's premiership and how the disagreement over what kind of Brexit to pursue or whether to remain in the EU in Parliament led to this impasse, to the cyclical majorities and all these kind of issues. And the question we're asking today is, what if we can look at these different options that we presented, remain, soft Brexit, hard Brexit, what if these form part of some underlying continuum? What if there's an underlying dimension of how hard a Brexit there should be? And we can then categorize this as this sort of Brexit dimension that ranges from remain to hard Brexit, maybe. And we can look at how much each group that we had, remember we had the Remainers, the Leavers, and the Ultras, how much each of these groups likes these different outcomes. So we can characterize their utility, if you want a fancy word. So higher outcomes on the scale are better. So let's look at how much each of these groups likes these different outcomes. Remember, we had the Remainers. Remainers preferred EU over soft over hard. So we can draw this into this graph in terms of their preferences. So the EU outcome is the highest, the soft Brexit the second best, and the hard Brexit the least. So there's a peak all the way at the left here, and the lowest option is all the way at the right. How about the Leavers? Well, the Leavers also fall nicely onto this spectrum. The Leavers have a strong preference for soft over a hard Brexit over EU. Again, these are both groups that have what we call single peaked preferences. So they have a point somewhere in this issue space and this Brexit degree of Brexitness that should be achieved. Somewhere in this issue space, they have an ideal point. They have their most preferred outcome. For the Remainers, that's the status quo, perhaps. For the Leavers, that is some sort of Brexit somewhere in the middle. And basically, their utility, how much they like these outcomes, declines as you move away from this ideal point. But what about the ultras, the last group? Well, the ultras, remember, they preferred hard over Remain over soft. And maybe some of you already thought that is a bit of a weird assumption, isn't it? And basically what is special about this, and I told some story for how this is a strategic choice. So what's different about this group? Well, this group does not have single peak preferences. They have two peaks in a way. And that's perfectly fine, of course, if you think of these issues as sort of separate issues. But in many cases, we think of these issue dimensions or ideological dimensions as sort of dimensions where people have single peak preferences. So maybe our assumption about the ultras here was a bit weird, and maybe some of you, like I said, already got stuck on that a little bit last time. Basically, what if we change the preferences of the ultras? What if the ultras do in fact prefer a soft Brexit over continued remaining in the EU? So this is the graph with the ultras sort of new preferences, hard over soft over EU, which perhaps makes a bit more sense if we think of the underlying sort of latent Brexit dimension. But like I said, depending on the alternatives that are being presented, it is okay to have different preferences over these outcomes. It is not necessarily the case that for everything there is some sort of latent dimension. But in this case, I think maybe it makes sense to assume that. Now, we've already explained the idea of single peakedness, right? So all of these preferences, all of these utility curves, if you want a very fancy word, have single peak preferences. They have their utilities maximized at some point on this ideological issue scale. And essentially, as you move away from a group's ideal point, utility declines. So the greater the distance, the greater the sort of utility loss. And this is basically the core of the spatial model of politics. Remember, a model is a simplified version of reality. So we're abstracting away from a lot of things here. We assume that there's a latent dimension. We assume single peak preferences. We make certain assumptions about the shape of these utility curves, basically. But the preferences, together with the institutions, with the type of game that is being played, then leads us to make sort of crisp predictions for outcomes. And that's the essence of any kind of modeling in political science, of course, to start with some relatively simple assumptions and feed them through this mathematical model and make clear predictions for what will happen. So what will happen now? Okay, so I have marked on this underlying Brexit dimension, issue dimension, I have marked the ideal points of these three groups. And remember, utility declines as you move away from these points. So their utility is based on distance alone. And so how would this process play out? Well, it would essentially be a bargaining process between these three groups, assuming they're sort of monoliths. It would be a bargaining process between these three groups. The same what would happen in a three-person committee. And so how would this work out? Well, maybe the Leavers and the Ultras could come to an agreement. They say, well, we need to get Brexit done. And they would agree on some sort of Brexit, according to Barnier's slide, maybe some sort of Brexit that satisfies sort of both the Ultras and the Leavers. Let's say the yellow marker here. What happens then? Well, they have an agreement. That's great, but it is really, really bad for the Remainers. So it is something between a soft and a hard Brexit. So it's very close to their worst sort of possible scenario. So what could they do? Well, they could, of course, make a counter-proposal. Remember, Parliament couldn't bind itself. One of the reasons we got stuck in the impasse was that there was no structure. There was no way to force structure on the voting process. So they can just make a counter-proposal. They can go to the levers and say, look, I know you negotiated this sort of outcome with the ultras, but that's really, really bad for us, and we can offer you something better. What's better? Well, basically, the outcome that the yellow outcome agreed between the ultras and the levers creates a space, something we call a win set. It creates a space of points on the Brexit dimension that are better for the levers than the yellow outcome. And the remainers could basically go to the lever and say, look, we offer you something that is better for you and better for us. What a great bargain. So they could offer, for example, the orange outcome, which is a very soft Brexit, say, okay? And this outcome would be better for the levers because it is closer to their ideal point, and it would obviously also be better for the remainers because it is closer to their ideal point. But it is, of course, quite bad for the ultras. Well, what would the ultras do? Well, the ultras could make a counter-proposal. Or we could think of the levers as the party with agency here that sort of plays out the two sides against each other. So the levers could go to the ultras and say, look, the remainers offered us this nice outcome quite close to our ideal point. Do you have something better? And of course, the ultras would be, don't like the orange outcome, so they could offer something that is better for them and better for the levers. So for example, the red outcome. So you already see where this is going. There could be another counter proposal, and essentially this can continue until we end up exactly at the ideal point of the levers. So by bargaining, by playing their cards right, the group in the middle here gets exactly what they want. And this is the core idea of the median voter theorem. So this middle group here is the median voter, or contains the median voter, if you think of these as 600 something MPs. So the if you line them all up, all these groups basically, the levers group is the middle group here, the median. So there's exactly the same number of MPs to the left as it is to the right of them on this dimension, and as a consequence, they are the median voter. And as we have just seen, in a committee type situation like this, through this sort of iterative bargaining process, or if people are strategic by just anticipating this outcome, the median voter gets exactly what they want. And that's quite interesting because we now also have a solution, of course, to the problem we had before. What has changed from the cyclical majorities problem? Well, I changed the preferences, of course. But what kind of assumption have I changed? Well, I've changed the assumption of universal admissibility, if you think in the arrow impossibility theorem kind of terms, right? I have forced the preferences of the ultras to be single-peaked in this issue space. And that's, of course, not something we can do in practice. We can't tell people what they prefer, and it didn't work in the end in the actual case study. Of course, this was not the outcome. But in practice, thinking about political competition more generally, it often makes sense to think of different alternatives falling onto some issue space. And if we have a one-dimensional policy space, and we have a median voter on this issue dimension, this median voter will get exactly their policy preference implemented. How did it end for Theresa May in the end? How did it end in this sense? This was not, of course, the case. The impasse continued, and the government fell, and there was a new election. But like I said, there's always a bigger game. So what we had just had three groups, and they were perfectly nicely distributed in this space. But what if that's not the case? What if there are more than 3 members? Or what if they don't fall so nicely into the issue space? So here's another example. Voters A, B, committee members A, B, C, D, and E have to decide on spending, say, less or more. So what would the outcome be? I want you to take a second, for real, pause the video, take a piece of paper and think about what your prediction is going to be in this scenario. Did you pause it? Did you make a prediction? So many students propose things somewhere between B and C, closer to C or so. So that's sort of the modal answer I get, I think, when I run this in class. But that is not the result. The result is C. The outcome here is also the median voters outcome. And the logic works the same way. Basically, C can play out these two groups, A and B and D and E, against each other and get to her most preferred outcome. And like I said before, this outcome is known as the median voter theorem. And the committee version with the bargaining and the counter proposals goes back to Duncan Black 1948. And basically what it states is that under certain assumptions, single peak preferences, one dimension of competition, no abstentions, two proposals at a time, then the outcome will be exactly the median voters ideal point. And how do we know this? Well, we can verify that this is essentially inertia equilibrium because there's no point in the issue space that can defeat the outcome C. Think about it this way. If the outcome is C, can A and B propose something that defeats it, that is closer? No. Can D and E propose something that is better than C? No. Basically, any proposal that is not exactly on C's ideal point, on the median voters ideal point, will get defeated in a vote. Let's look at one more example. I am sure many of you have been following the latest season of American politics. It's been quite a ride. But maybe we can apply the median voter theorem to the newly elected US Senate. So maybe we can represent these senators on an ideological dimension from sort of left to right. Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right. And who's in this case, who would be the sort of most leftist senator? If you squint and look sort of all the way at the top left, the little isolated figurine, who is it? Look closer, look closer. Oh, it's Bernie Sanders sitting there, okay? And on who's the rightmost senator? I don't know, maybe Ted Cruz or maybe this character. So what happens now? So there's, if you followed the sort of coverage closely, you know that the Democrats won the Georgia runoffs, and there's now a 50-50 tie in the Senate. What happens if there's a tie? Well, the president of the Senate, the vice president, gets to be the tiebreaker. So Kamala Harris will decide the ties. So is she the median voter? Will she get what she wants? Is her ideal point the important thing? Think about it for a second. No, that's not the case, right? Because, of course, Kamala Harris is to the left of many other Democratic senators. So while her vote will be decisive if there's a tie, the person we really have to look at, of course, is what is sometimes called the pivotal senator. And now it gets a bit messy. So sometimes it depends on the rules. And if there's a filibuster, it's the 60th senator. So it's actually some guy from the Republicans. The 10 least conservative Republican would be the person to convince, and everyone to the left of them. That's going to be a hard sell. But for other other rules, nominations for confirming nominations, for example, and maybe also getting rid of filibuster, 50 votes plus the tiebreaker would be enough. So who is the median senator then? Well, the rightmost Democrat, it's a guy called Joe Manchin. He's the senator from West Virginia, and I think you will hear his name many times in the next 2 years. And I think because basically I think after Joe Biden, he's probably the most powerful man in the US. Because he is the median senator for many issues that have to be voted on. So anything the Democrats want to do, they will need him to agree to it. Only he will get them to the tiebreaker, which then Kamala Harris will vote in a way that is in line with of course the Democrats more generally. So Joe Manchin is the median voter, the median senator, in this case. And that means that he will essentially be able to dictate policy. If he doesn't like some democratic proposal, it's probably dead on arrival. So that's something to keep in mind. So that our prediction would basically that whatever this guy wants will be policy, will become law. Whoever he doesn't like will not get confirmed. But I've said there's always a bigger game, right? So in this case, what would you do if you were the sort of Democratic leadership or Biden and Harris? Well, you would think about, whether this specific person, Joe mentioned, whether he would be willing to trade policy concessions on this ideological scale for other things. Not suggesting bribes, of course, but in American politics, of course, what is called pork barrel spending. So local spending, federal spending in West Virginia in this case. So this is really good news for contractors and all sorts of companies probably in West Virginia, where there's a bonanza of federal money coming their way. But basically, you distribute private goods in a way, or local public goods to the person you need to make policy, to support you. It's exactly like when we talked about the sort of the logic in the Dictator's Handbook, right? So maybe paying off this guy in terms of specific spending rather than policy concessions will be the big game. So he will be a very happy man, and his constituents will get a lot of federal money spent on them. So this lecture, when it is done in the classroom, is usually very interactive, and we can't do that. But I have tried to convert this to the lecture format and to keep some of these interactive elements as sort of homework tasks. So I would suggest you do them. None of them should take very long, and there's basically one at the end of each video. And I want you to do them at this point in the lecture, ideally, where we've just discussed this issue before we look at other things. But definitely please do them before the seminar. And what I want you to do now is basically pause the video, stop watching, go to Moodle and click on the first homework on party positions. And I want you to, for either your home country or a country you're very familiar with politically, I want you to identify all the major parties in parliament and the seat chairs. And I would like you to place them on see whether you can place them on a left-right continuum.